For as long as I can remember, I've been a huge fan of classic animation. As a boy, I would collect VHS tapes of animated movies and spend countless days watching them. Whether or not I want to admit it, these films were a huge part of my life. Everything changed when I was about 9 on one fateful trip to my great-grandmother's house. My great-grandmother had an enormous collection of tapes in her attic, complete with an area to view them. By the attic stairs, an old TV sat hooked up to a VHS player with a mattress in front, the perfect place to watch movies. I can recall only a handful of times we went to her house, but one visit stands out in particular. That's when I watched that movie. One evening, I was nosing around in her attic, looking through her movie collection for some animated movie I had never seen before. Every title was familiar, and I considered watching Fern Gully until I noticed a tape resting on the top shelf. It was without a cover, and the only marking on it was a sticker that read, "The White Door." I had never heard of this movie. Excitedly, I popped the video in the player and got comfortable. I had no idea what I was in for. The movie started off with a victorious fanfare and a panning shot of crimson-colored clouds. As the clouds drifted past the screen, the music grew more and more cheerful until the clouds eventually raced off screen, revealing the title of the movie. Placed in the sky were massive golden letters that read, "The White Door." From the looks of the animation and the quality of the music, I would guess the movie was made in the late 80s. The title sequence faded away, and the opening scene began with a small blonde-haired boy wandering through darkness until he came across a massive white door. He stopped before it and gazed upward curiously, examining the colossal entryway. The door opened, and heavenly light poured in all around him. With a hand over his eyes, he slowly ventured inside. Harp music presented the scene as the boy crept through the doors. The entire screen was overtaken by bright white light. The scene faded back in to reveal the boy standing on a plateau of white, purple, and pink clouds. He was dressed in a white robe and had very small wings protruding from his back. It was, of course, implied that the boy had died. I was slightly taken aback by this. Why had he died? This concept seemed a little too dark for an animated children's movie. The small angel boy looked around, searching for some explanation for his whereabouts. The music had long since gone away, and the movie cycled through various shots of the boy slowly walking around looking for any sign that he was not alone. He stopped searching and looked down at his feet. "I'm all alone," he said on the verge of tears. "I don't know where everybody is, and I'm all alone." The boy began crying. "I want to go home," he yelled several times, crying more and more with each pitiful shout. His crying was disturbingly realistic. He sat down on the ground and began bawling, "I want to go home." I felt a chill race up my spine. This child was in agony, absolutely alone in what was supposed to be paradise. The boy's wailing was interrupted when a small brown dog ran by, grabbing his attention. Immediately his tears were dried, and he began to follow the dog, cheering, "Chester, I can't believe you're here, Chester." He skipped and laughed as he attempted to catch his pet, but the dog always seemed to be just out of reach. It may have been my imagination, but I noticed something strange in the background. There were clouds decorating the back scenery, blacked out as not to distract the viewer, but some of these soft shapes looked abnormal. As the boy ran, the clouds started to look like distant human silhouettes, silently watching him. The boy finally caught up to the dog and leaped forward, hoping to greet him with a loving hug. As soon as the boy touched the animal, he realized that it was merely a cloud that resembled a dog. It burst into little white puffs. He began crying again, this time louder and clearly more heartbroken. He truly was alone. He continued weeping and did not seem to notice what happened next. A deep voice chimed in, offering this simple statement, "You know he cannot come with you." The screen immediately cut to black, and the film began emitting a gentle noise. It sounded like gears grinding together, but I could only barely hear it. I really should have turned the TV off at that point. I wanted to so very badly, but I could not move. My legs were glued to the floor and my eyes were transfixed on the screen. I simply had to see what was going to happen next. In an instant, the sound of gears cut away, and the next scene began. The rich colors were intoxicating, and I found myself gawking at the sheer aesthetic beauty of this bizarre movie. A massive, beautiful tree overlooked a green field, and the same angel boy sat underneath it. Harp music was playing, the same as before, but this time it sounded less heavenly. Perhaps it was a sneaking suspicion as to what I was about to behold, but the music seemed foreboding. The great tree, as the boy called it, was listening to the boy's woes with great attendance and spoke back to him. The tree's voice was, for lack of a better word, creepy. It makes me shudder just to think about it. I really cannot explain it. It was one of the weirdest things I've ever heard. The tree would sway from side to side and speak in a quiet, muffled voice that was almost impossible to fully hear. It sounded like a man's voice stretched to an impossibly high pitch, but muffled through some thick object. I couldn't understand a single word he said, but the angel boy heard everything. They shared a seemingly mild conversation as the boy asked simple questions about where he was and what happened to his family. With each of the great tree's responses, the boy would lower his head in sadness, as if he were accepting some morbid fact. I was curious about the significance of this scene. Was the tree supposed to be God or some other heavenly being? There was no clarification toward any of the pressing questions that perpetually plagued my mind. After the great tree had answered all of his questions, he began talking continuously. He was babbling on about something that apparently angered him because the child stood up from where he was seated and slowly walked back from the tree. He wore a look of paranoia, as if he were afraid the tree would lash out toward him at any moment. Suddenly, there was a new perspective. The camera gradually zoomed in on a shot of the tree, alone, slowly swaying back and forth. He was talking very calmly, from what I could hear, and his voice sounded foggy and distant. The boy began crying again, his wails heard from off-screen. His weeping slowly evolved into pain-induced screams, and he was shouting as loud as he could, "Stop it! Please stop! Help me! Help me!" My blood ran cold. This was the sound of a child being beaten. With every passing second, the boy was screaming louder, but the tree kept its calm disposition while gently swaying back and forth. I couldn't see the boy, but hearing him cry for help was unbearable. I was nearly in tears at this point, and I didn't want to watch anymore. I got up to turn off the TV, but as soon as I moved, the screen went black and started playing the familiar grinding gears noise. This time, it was considerably louder. Amongst the loud metallic sound, I noticed a subtle oddity. I thought I could hear a very quiet voice whispering something, but any indication of this was drowned out by the loud gears. What awaited me in the next scene shook me to the core. Without any graceful transition, the next scene forced itself into the movie, as if it was not intended to be there. Distorted music was playing at inconsistent volumes, and the entire color scheme was off. Something was seriously wrong. Suddenly, the music stopped. The boy was lying on the ground, arms crossed on his chest. His eyes were closed, and his face looked hollow. All around his body, roses perched out of the ground, arranged in a neat little circle. The roses grew noticeably quick. In a matter of seconds, the roses were a few feet high, but all the while, the child did not move. There was no life in him. The only sound was the occasional ominous piano note, punctuating the silence. The roses grew very high, but all at once would go back to being small, restarting the cycle. The boy remained motionless. I was horrified. I watched with tear-filled eyes, cupping my hand over my mouth. In the last few seconds of the scene, the tree's muffled voice broke in, saying something I simply could not understand. Just as abruptly as it began, the scene closed with a cut to black. The same rusty gears made their painful sound, but the noise was unbearably loud and accompanied by a loud, sweeping voice. It only lasted for a few seconds, and the entire time I struggled to comprehend what the voice was saying. Then, in the last second, I knew exactly what it was saying. He's coming. The tape reached its end, and I was left staring at a blue stop screen. I didn't do anything for a few minutes. The floor was victim to my glazed-over stare. Eventually, I came to my senses and sneaked back downstairs. I didn't want to talk to anybody about this because I just didn't want to think about it. I tried to pretend it never happened. I cried myself to sleep that night, and many nights after. The feeling was impossible to shake. I still think about that movie with every detail so vividly etched in the back of my mind. As the years went by, I tried to move on from that unsettling experience. I threw myself into more familiar and comforting animations, avoiding anything that might remind me of the white door. High school and college kept me busy, and eventually the memories of that bizarre movie began to blur. Yet in the quiet moments of the night, when I was alone with my thoughts, I could still hear that haunting whisper. He's coming. My life took me far from my childhood home and great-grandmother's attic. I pursued a career in animation, hoping to create the kind of joy I had once found in those old tapes. Despite my success, a part of me always felt uneasy, as if something from my past was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to resurface. One rainy evening, I received a phone call from my mother. My great-grandmother had passed away, and we were to go through her belongings to settle her estate. I hadn't been to her house in years, and the thought of returning to that attic filled me with a mixture of nostalgia and dread. Nevertheless, I agreed to help. When I arrived at my great-grandmother's house, the familiar scent of old wood and dust greeted me. The attic was exactly as I remembered it, with the same old TV and VHS player, though now covered in a thin layer of dust. The boxes of tapes were still there, untouched since my last visit. As I began to sort through them, my heart raced with each one I picked up, fearing I might stumble upon the white door again. Hours passed, and I had almost convinced myself that the tape was gone, maybe lost or thrown away. But as I reached the bottom of a box, my fingers brushed against something cold and familiar. I pulled out the unmarked tape with the sticker that read "The White Door." My hands trembled as I held it, memories flooding back in an overwhelming wave. Despite every instinct telling me to leave it alone, I felt compelled to watch it again. Maybe it was a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a need to confront the ghost that had haunted me for so long. I plugged the VHS into the player, the same one I had used as a child, and pressed play. The movie started exactly as I remembered, with the victorious fanfare and crimson clouds. The golden letters of the title appeared, and a shiver ran down my spine. I braced myself for what was to come, determined to see it through this time. As the movie progressed, each scene felt like a dagger to my memory, cutting through the years of suppression. The angel boy, the great tree, the harrowing cries of the child. It was all there, just as terrifying and surreal as before. But this time, something was different. Subtle changes in the animation and sound made the experience even more unnerving, as if the movie itself had aged, becoming more distorted with time. When the scene with the roses began, I found myself gripping the edge of the mattress, heart pounding in my chest. The boy's lifeless body, the cyclical growth of the roses, and the ominous piano notes all played out before me. But this time, when the tree's voice broke in, I could understand what it was saying. He's almost here. The realization hit me like a freight train. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The screen cut to black, and the grinding gears noise returned, louder and more menacing than before. The whispering voice emerged clearer now. He's coming for you. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, eyes locked on the screen. The tape ended, and the familiar blue stop screen filled the room with an eerie silence. I sat there, unable to process what had just happened. Eventually, I gathered the courage to stand up. I ejected the tape and held it in my hands, contemplating what to do next. I knew I couldn't keep it. This relic from my past had too much power over me. I decided to destroy it, hoping that doing so might finally put an end to its haunting presence in my life. I took the tape outside, the rain still pouring down, pasted on the ground. With a heavy heart and a sense of finality, I stomped on it, crushing the plastic casing beneath my foot. The tape inside snapped and unraveled, exposed to the elements. I watched as the rain washed away the fragments, feeling a strange sense of relief. As I stood there in the rain, drenched and shivering, I realized that the haunting might never truly leave me. But I had faced it, confronted the source of my childhood fear, and taken control. I hoped that, in time, the whispers would fade and the memory of the white door would lose its grip on my soul. And maybe, just maybe, I could finally find peace. Despite my efforts to destroy the tape, the sense of dread that it had awakened in me only grew stronger. The whispers persisted, louder and more frequent, echoing through my mind in the dead of night. He's coming. It felt as though the very act of breaking the tape had only angered whatever force was connected to it. A few days later, I started noticing strange occurrences around my apartment. Shadows seemed to move on their own, flickering in the corners of my vision. Objects would be in different places from where I remembered leaving them. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of fear settled over me. One night, as I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard the sound of gears grinding together, just like in the movie. My heart pounded as I realized it was coming from my living room. I gathered my courage and walked out to investigate. The grinding grew louder as I approached, leading me to the TV, which was now flickering with static despite being unplugged. The static shifted, forming the outline of a familiar figure, the angel boy from the white door. His eyes were hollow and empty, his face etched with sorrow. He reached out from the screen, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I spun around to see nothing but empty air. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and crashing to the floor. The grinding noise intensified, filling my ears with its deafening roar. The boy on the screen seemed to grow larger, his outstretched hand almost breaching the surface of the TV. Suddenly, the screen went black, and the noise stopped. I was left in eerie silence, my breathing ragged and my heart racing. The apartment felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to find out what was happening and how to stop it. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit my great-grandmother's house one last time. Perhaps there was something there, some clue that could help me understand this curse. I drove through the night, the darkness pressing in on all sides, making the journey feel like a descent into madness. When I arrived, the house loomed ominously in the dim light of early dawn. I let myself in and headed straight for the attic. The familiar scent of dust and old wood greeted me, but this time it was tinged with a sense of malevolence. I searched through the boxes, hoping to find anything that could explain the origins of the white door. As I dug deeper, I found an old journal belonging to my great-grandmother. The entries detailed her life, but also contained strange references to a mysterious tape that had appeared in her collection one day. She wrote about how the tape seemed to be alive, how watching it had filled her with dread and despair. She mentioned the same whispers, the same ominous message, "He's coming." One entry in particular caught my eye. It described a ritual to banish the entity connected to the tape. The instructions were vague, but it involved returning to the place where the tape was found and performing a series of actions to break the curse. I knew it was my only chance. Armed with the knowledge from the journal, I gathered the necessary items and headed to the place where the tape had originally been discovered, a small clearing in the woods behind my great-grandmother's house. The air grew colder as I approached, and the whispers intensified, swirling around me like a swarm of angry bees. In the clearing, I set up the ritual, following the steps as best as I could. The final part involved playing a recording of the grinding gears and reciting an incantation from the journal. As I did so, the ground beneath me trembled, and a dark, shadowy figure began to rise from the earth. It was the angel boy, but twisted and monstrous, his hollow eyes now burning with malevolent intent. He lunged at me, and I felt his icy fingers wrap around my throat. I struggled, gasping for air, but I managed to complete the incantation just as darkness began to close in. There was a blinding flash of light, and the boy let out an unearthly scream. The ground shook violently, and the figure dissolved into the air, leaving behind nothing but an eerie silence. The whisper ceased, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The curse was broken. The entity that had haunted me for so long was finally gone. As I stood up and made my way back to the house, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, bringing with them a sense of peace and new beginnings. I knew I would never forget the horrors I had faced, but at least now I could move forward without the constant fear of what lurked in the shadows. The memory of the white door would always be with me, but it no longer had the power to control my life. I left the clearing with a sense of finality, but also a lingering unease. The events that had transpired felt surreal, almost like a fever dream. As I drove back to my apartment, the morning sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the landscape. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Back at home, I tried to resume my normal life. The whispers had ceased, and the shadows no longer seemed to move on their own. For the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of peace. However, the experience had left its mark, and I found myself jumping at small noises and avoiding the living room where the TV had come to life. One evening, a few weeks later, I received a package at my door with no return address. Inside was an old VHS tape, identical to the one I had destroyed. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, and a chill ran down my spine when I saw the sticker, the white door. Panic surged through me. I had destroyed the tape, performed the ritual, and faced the entity. How could it be back? Against my better judgment, I decided to watch the tape. I needed to understand if this was the same tape or if someone was playing a cruel joke on me. I connected my old VHS player to the TV and inserted the tape, bracing myself for the worst. The tape started with the same fanfare and crimson clouds, the golden letters spelling out the white door. But this time something was different. The animation was distorted, flickering like a corrupted file. The angel boy appeared, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow, but he was not alone. Dark figures stood behind him, their features obscured by shadows. The scene shifted to the boy standing in the plateau of clouds, dressed in his white robe. The clouds around him were darker, almost stormy, and the heavenly light was dim. The boy turned towards the screen, and I could see the torment in his eyes. He spoke directly to me, his voice a haunting whisper. "You shouldn't have destroyed the tape. Now he's angrier." The screen flickered, and the grinding gears noise began again, louder and more menacing than ever. The familiar tree appeared, its branches swaying ominously. The tree spoke in its distorted, muffled voice, but this time I could understand every word. "He's coming for you." The boy's wails returned, echoing through the room, and the dark figures began to move closer to him. Their eyes glowed a sinister red, and they reached out with claw-like hands. The boy's screams grew louder, more desperate as the figures surrounded him. Suddenly, the screen cut to black, and a message appeared in bold white letters. "You cannot escape." I frantically ejected the tape, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I knew I had to get rid of it, but the fear that it would simply reappear gnawed at me. I needed to find a way to end this once and for all. I reached out to a friend who was knowledgeable about the occult and paranormal. After explaining my situation, she agreed to help. We spent the next few days researching rituals and protective measures, trying to find a way to sever the connection with the tape permanently. We discovered an ancient ritual involving salt, fire, and a sacred incantation. The ritual required performing a cleansing ceremony in the exact location where the tape first emerged, the attic of my great-grandmother's house. With a sense of dread, I agreed to return there once more. We gathered the necessary items and made our way to the house. The attic felt even more oppressive than before. the air thick with a malevolent presence. We set up the ritual space, drawing a circle of salt around the area and placing candles at its points. As we began the incantation, the temperature dropped and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The tape sat in the center of the circle, its presence almost palpable. We lit the candles and started chanting, focusing on breaking the bond between the tape and the entity it harbored. The attic filled with a blinding light, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. The tape began to shake violently, as if fighting against the ritual. With one final unified chant, we threw the tape into the fire. It burned with an unnatural intensity, the flames turning a sickly green. The roar reached a crescendo, and then, all at once, it stopped. The flames died down, and the attic was plunged into silence. We stood there, breathless and shaken, hoping that we had finally succeeded. As we cleaned up, a sense of calm settled over the attic. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the air felt lighter. I knew that the entity was gone, banished by the ritual. Leaving the house for the last time, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The whispers had ceased, and the shadows no longer seemed to move on their own. For the first time in a long while, I felt a true sense of peace. The haunting of the white door was finally over, and I could move forward, free from its grasp. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, its silhouette fading into the distance. I knew I would never forget the horrors I had faced, but at least now they were behind me. The memory of the white door would remain, but its power over me was broken. I could finally live my life without fear, knowing that the past was truly behind me. After the intense ritual and the destruction of the cursed tape, I thought I had finally rid myself of the haunting presence that had tormented me for so long. However, the feeling of being watched, the cold chills that ran down my spine, and the faint whispers that returned at night made me realize that something was still wrong. Desperate for answers, I embarked on a journey to seek help from those who might understand what I was dealing with. I traveled to various places, consulting experts in the occult, paranormal investigators, and even psychologists. Each offered different theories, but none could provide a definitive solution. My journey took me to old libraries, abandoned houses, and remote villages, but the answers I sought remained elusive. I felt as though I was on a wild goose chase, each clue leading me to another dead end. Then, in a small secluded village nestled in the mountains, I heard about a reclusive old monk who was said to have profound knowledge of the supernatural. People in the village spoke of him with reverence and fear, describing him as a wise man who could see beyond the physical world. Desperate and with nothing to lose, I decided to seek him out. The monk lived in an ancient temple, hidden away from the rest of the world. The journey to reach him was arduous, involving a steep climb up a winding mountain path. As I approached the temple, I was struck by its serene beauty. The place exuded a sense of calm and tranquility, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had plagued me for so long. Inside the temple, the air was thick with the scent of incense. The old monk sat cross-legged on a mat, his eyes closed in meditation. I hesitated at the entrance, unsure of how to approach him, but before I could say a word, he opened his eyes and looked directly at me. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see into my very soul. Without any introductions, he spoke. "You are followed by a restless spirit," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It clings to you, feeding off your fear and despair." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was both terrifying and a relief. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do I get rid of it?" The monk gestured for me to sit. "To banish a spirit, you must understand why it clings to you. Often it is bound by unresolved issues, a lingering attachment to the mortal world." He paused, studying me intently. "Tell me everything from the beginning." I recounted my entire ordeal, the mysterious tape, the horrifying scenes, the ritual in my great-grandmother's attic, and the persistent feeling of being watched. The monk listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he remained silent for a moment, deep in thought. The spirit you encountered was powerful, but it was not entirely malevolent. It was trying to communicate something important, something you have not yet understood, he said finally. We must perform a cleansing ritual, not just to banish the spirit, but to help it find peace. He instructed me to gather certain items, a lock of my hair, a piece of silver, a mirror, and a handful of earth from my great-grandmother's house. These, he explained, would help anchor the spirit and allow us to communicate with it directly. Returning to the temple with the items, the monk prepared the ritual space. He drew intricate symbols on the ground with chalk, placed candles at each point of a star, and positioned the items at the center. He then handed me a small, ancient-looking bell. When the time comes, you will ring this bell to summon the spirit. As night fell, the atmosphere in the temple grew heavy with anticipation. The monk began chanting in a language I didn't understand, his voice resonating with a deep, rhythmic cadence. The candles flickered and a cold breeze swept through the room, causing the flames to dance. I sat in the center of the star, holding the bell tightly. The monk's chants grew louder, and I felt a strange energy building up around us. The air crackled with tension, and the temperature dropped sharply. Suddenly, I saw a shadowy figure materialize in front of me. It was the angel boy from the tape, but his form was twisted and sorrowful. The monk stopped chanting and nodded at me. With trembling hands, I rang the bell. The sound was clear and pure, cutting through the heavy silence. The boy's figure wavered, and he looked at me with those haunting hollow eyes. "Why do you follow me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The boy's expression softened, and he began to speak. His voice was ethereal, echoing with sorrow and longing. I was trapped, bound to the tape. I sought help, but my cries were misunderstood. I needed someone to free me, to help me move on. Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened. "How can I help you find peace?" I asked. "Release my spirit," he replied. "Scatter the earth over the tape's remains and speak the words of release." The monk handed me a small pouch containing the earth from my great-grandmother's house. I stood up, walked to the center of the ritual space, and scattered the earth over the remnants of the tape. The boy's figure began to dissolve, his form becoming lighter and more translucent. As I spoke the words the monk had taught me, the boy's face lit up with a gentle smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice fading. "He will not come anymore." With those final words, the boy's spirit dissipated into the air, leaving behind a profound sense of calm and relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room felt lighter. The monk smiled at me, a look of satisfaction in his eyes. "You have done well," he said. "The spirit is at peace, and you are free from its grasp." I thanked the monk profusely, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. As I left the temple, I felt a sense of closure that I had never experienced before. The whispers, the shadows, and the cold chills were gone. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace,